3800 V6 versus 4.3 liter V6. NA versus NA versus mods. Then we add some boost. Hello everybody, I'm Rich Holder, and please welcome to the channel. Before we get going, one thing you'll notice, I run a lot of Holley stuff on a lot of these. In fact, it seems like almost every fuel-injected motor I run anymore, we run with the Holley HP management system. You can also use Terminator. We also run the Holley carburetors and long tube headers from Hooker and MSD distributors, yada, 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 all of that stuff. Right now, I mention it because Holley's going to be having a big sale coming up, I guess, for Christmas. So if you're looking for good deals for yourself for Christmas or for a loved one, head over to Holley.com and check them out. But today we're going to take a look at a comparison between a 3800 V6 and a 4.3 liter V6. But let's jump right into our test. We're taking a look at a cool comparison between two popular V6 motors. On one side, we have the 3800 V6, ostensibly the supercharged version, but we ran it also NA. And then we have the ubiquitous 4.3 liter, 3/4 of a small block Chevy V8, also good, but how do they compare? So in this video, I'm going to show you what happens when we run them basically in stock trim on the engine dyno, after we do a few mods to them, and then after we add some boost. Let's check it out. Okay, now we're going to take a look at a comparison between two different V6 motors, a 3.8 liter, or actually it's called a 3800, and a 4.3 liter, which is not called a 4300. So right off the bat, for the guys that want, this has got to be an apples to apples test. They've got to have the same heads and the same cam and the same intake. Unfortunately, that can't happen. I mean, they're completely different engine families, so the same things don't really apply to them. The heads are not going to be the same. The intakes then are not going to be the same. We can put the same or similar camshafts in them, and both of them can run superchargers. So the very best thing that we can do here is we can take a look at stock versions of both of the motors that we ran on the engine dyno. Then we could take a look at mildly modified NA versions, both of them on the engine dyno. And then we could take a look at supercharged versions of both of them on the engine dyno to show you, hey, look, which one would you pick? Would you pick the 3800 Series 2, or would you pick the 4.3 liter Vortech motor? So here we go. We're going to start off with our naturally aspirated combinations. These are stock or stockish, and I'll go ahead and I'll tell you the detailed descriptions of each one of them. We'll start off with a 3800, and on the 3800, we actually could have picked a better version because we picked an L67, which is the supercharged version of this V6 that came in Pontiac Grand Prix GTPs, Buick Regal GSs, and Bonnevilles and the like. But because we ran this thing NA, we removed the supercharger assembly and put on an intake manifold, but we would have made more power had we just started out with a naturally aspirated version of this, because it had higher compression and it would have done, a little better having an extra point of compression. They lowered the compression for supercharger use, which is pretty normal, but we ran a naturally aspirated intake manifold on it, and we're going to talk about that. So let's take a look at our description. We have a 3800, we have a L67 bottom end, we actually have L32, which is the later version of the supercharged version. L32 heads on it. They had a valve spring upgrade because later on we would be putting camshafts in it. What we had is, for an intake manifold, we replaced the supercharger. Basically, we hollowed it out and put an end cap on it and had the lower blower intake manifold, and then had the supercharger with the throttle body assembly being the top part of the manifold. So all the air came through the blower, went into the blower, into the lower manifold. The thing that it does, not so much with the blower thing, but what it does is the lower manifold for the supercharger is a short runner manifold. So it's missing out on some of the low speed power that it would have if it had the longer manifold, or if we would have just run the naturally aspirated combination, which would be, an even better comparison in this case. But this is what we ran, and this is what happened. So run with the accessories and tubular exhaust, and then a 3-inch exit as they merged together, and run with the Holley HP management system. We had 80 pound injectors in this thing, because eventually we would put the supercharger back on and make even more power, but run in naturally aspirated trim, basically with a stock cam and stock heads and that lower intake manifold. 215 horsepower at 5,300, and peak torque checked in at 240 foot-pounds. Let's compare that to the 4.3 liter. So here is our 4.3 liter, and I'm going to go ahead and move myself up here, get out of the way so you guys can see this. It's interesting that the 4.3 liter did kind of what we'd expect. It did make a lot more torque. In fact, up here, if we compare it after the load in, you know, we're looking at 282 foot-pounds of torque. So it made a lot more torque than the 3800 did. It did, however, make less power, though. It made 206 horsepower. Now, the 4.3 liter was originally a factory fuel-injected motor, but we didn't run it that way. In this case, we were putting this motor in a boat, and it was going in that boat carbureted, so that's exactly what we did. We put an Edelbrock intake manifold on it and a matching Edelbrock carburetor. We ran it with the stock head, stock cam, and then the Edelbrock intake and carburetor with an MSD distributor, and then the stock exhaust manifolds also with just an open exhaust exiting after the stock exhaust manifolds. Run in that manner, our 4.3 liter produced 207 horsepower, 282 foot-pounds of torque. So more torque, less horsepower for the 4.3 liter, and I think that some of that is probably just because of the short runner intake manifold on the 3800, but let me know what you guys think in the comments. Now let's take a look and see what happens when we run some mods. Now let's take a look and see what modified versions of these 3800 versus the 4.3 liter do. So we got our 3800, and we're going to take a look at the configuration. We have, first of all, we've removed the blower intake manifold with the blower housing and replaced that with an actual NA intake manifold with long runner throttle entry on it. We have our stock bottom end. We have, this one actually has mildly ported L67 heads on it. It has a camshaft in it from ZZP. It is a 507 lift, 220, 230 at 50 and 112 degree lobe separation angle. We still have our Holly on there and stuff. And what we've done is installed the camshaft basically in the long tube runners. And the combination made 262 horsepower and 271 foot-pounds of torque. And here's an interesting comparison. This is the long runner manifold, but because of the way they're configured, you can actually take the upper part of the intake manifold off and remove a bunch of runner length. And here's what happened when you do that. You can pick up power at the top, which is typical of short runners, but you do lose power down below. In fact, everywhere below 5,500, you lose power, and then above that, you do pick up power. So I just wanted to show you guys that as an interesting little tidbit. Here is how the modified combination compares of the 3800 compares to the modified combination on the 4.3 liter. 4.3 liter, as it has before, makes a lot more torque. It's a bigger motor, carbureted, almost 300 foot-pounds of torque, 298 foot-pounds, although it did make slightly less horsepower, 251 horsepower. On the 4.3 liter, what we did was install a comp cam. The cam was a 525 lift, a 224 both intake and exhaust, 224 duration both intake and exhaust, and 110 degree lobe separation angle. It still had the Edelbrock Performer intake manifold and the Edelbrock Performer carburetor. So basically all the 4.3 got was a better camshaft and valve springs on the cylinder heads. So this worked out good, but again, you could see 3800 making a little more power out on the top end, although it did also have mildly ported heads, so it's an interesting comparison. It does have less compression than the 4.3 liter, but as we can see, still the same thing is kind of happening. The bigger motor makes more power, makes more torque down low, and then the 3800 is making a little more power on the top. But let's find out what happens when we add boost. Now it's time to take a look at our final modified versions of our 3800 versus the 4.3 liter, and these are both supercharged. Now we did run different superchargers on them. On the 3800, naturally we ran the OE, or at least for the Gen 5 motor, the L32, we ran a Gen 5 M90 supercharger. For the 4.3 liter, we actually installed a TORQSTORM supercharger because we had a TORQSTORM kit originally designed for a small block Chevy, but since the 4.3 liter is basically 3/4 of a V8, the TORQSTORM supercharger bolted right on and made good power, as we will see. But let's take a look at our configuration on the 3800. So we have our stock bottom end. We have ported L67 heads. We have our comp cam, or ZZP cam, which is a 507, 220, 230 at 50, 112 degree lobe separation angle. We have the stock lower intake manifold. We have a, meaning that it's unported. We have an intercooler this time on the underneath the blower. We have hopped the blower up quite a bit, or sped it up with a 2.6 inch drive pulley. That's changing. The stock one was 3.8, so it's a pretty big change. We're running about 13 pounds of boost here. So we have our stock bottom end with a cam, ported heads, intercooler, sped the blower up. It still has the tubular exhaust on it, and run in this manner on E85. Our supercharged 3.8 liter 3800 produced 448 horsepower and 434 foot-pounds of torque. How does that compare to our 4.3 liter, also run boosted? Here is our 4.3 liter. The 4.3 liter actually made a little bit more power. In fact, we stopped the run at 58 or 5900 RPM. The boost was already getting up a little over 13 pounds from the TORQSTORM. We really didn't want to run it any higher than that. We weren't going to be running the motor with the blower on it anyway, and this motor, as I said, eventually went in a boat with the milder camshaft in it. But our 4.3 liter configuration still had the comp cam in it, the 525, 224, 110 camshaft in it, but we added a TORQSTORM centrifugal supercharger. The blower was configured with a 3.25 inch blower pulley and a 7 3/4 inch crank pulley. We also replaced the Edelbrock carburetor with a dedicated CSU blow-through 850 carburetor, and so we ran the discharge from the blower to a bonnet and then down onto the CSU carburetor, and then this thing produced, as I said, was on its way to producing even more boost, but about 13 to 13.5 pounds there, where our little supercharged combination produced 461 horsepower, and the peak torque checked in at 423 foot-pounds. You can see down below 5,200 RPM, the 4.3 liter was now producing less torque than the supercharged 3800, and the reason for that is because of the boost curves offered by the different superchargers. The positive displacement M90 on the 3800 had basically immediate boost, whereas the centrifugal supercharger, the TORQSTORM, had a rising boost curve. So the boost was very, very low down here at 3,500 RPM and started to climb fairly rapidly as we went past 5,500 RPM. So there you have it. Two good V6s. Both of them obviously can make really good power, especially in modified form. The 4.3 liter, had we done ported heads, and I would like to have put a different camshaft in there. But certainly a lot of power from each of them. Let me know in the comments which one would you choose. Armature holder, please make sure to like, share, subscribe, ring the bell, do all that stuff, and I'll keep testing.